The Provoke Podcast, brought to you by Provoke Media and produced by the international broadcast specialist Marketeers.
Welcome, everybody, to the second installment in Provoke Media's new CCO Podcast series. And I am joined here today by Moira Gilchrist, who is the CCO at PMI. We are going to be looking back over her first full year in that role, the challenges, the opportunities, the research that she's conducted, and some of the unexpected events that have come along over the course of the year. Why don't we just start, Moira, with you introducing yourself and telling people a little bit about your background?
Well, hi, Paul, and a pleasure to join you on the podcast. So I'm a little bit of a unicorn, I think, in communication circles, because I didn't train as a communicator. I'm actually a scientist by training, and cut my teeth on scientific communications before I was put into this role at the beginning of the year. So I think I see things perhaps through a slightly different perspective than maybe many of your listeners will. I've been with Philip Morris International for, almost 19 years. I started at the very beginning of what we now call our transformation, to help the company start to develop and scientifically assess smoke-free alternatives to cigarettes. And I came from the pharmaceutical industry to bring my skills and expertise that I had learned there to the task of transforming the whole company. And I have to say, there's never been a dull moment, and I've enjoyed every single piece of it.
I'm sort of intrigued by that background because, scientific and technical expertise is becoming much more important to communicators in a whole range of industries. You mentioned the pharmaceutical sector, where that's clearly true. But obviously there's a lot of communications around environmental and sustainability issues now that requires a high degree of expertise. And one of the sort of traditional myths, I guess, of the PR business is that scientists are not good communicators. Tell me a little bit about your journey from sort of scientist to communicator and what you found easy and what you found challenging.
Well, if I think back to the days of my PhD, I think what I didn't enjoy was the lab work. I really did not find myself with joy working in the lab trying to figure out what to do with regards to experiments. But what I thoroughly enjoyed was explaining it. So writing up the thesis and defending it in front of experts. That was a real passion of mine. Trying to make sense of the data, trying to understand patterns and communicate those through essentially storytelling. So I think that's where my passion for communication really started. So right back at almost the beginning of my career. And I do take a little bit issue with the assumption that scientists are not good communicators. I think some are not, but I think many are, because there's very little point in your data, staying in a laboratory notebook, because it doesn't benefit society. What I think many scientists have done is understood that they do need to be out there and explaining what the data means, putting it into a bigger context, and also simplifying it for non-experts. And I think that's what I worked on a lot, is taking very complex subjects, distilling them down to their essence and what they mean for society and different groups of stakeholders. And that's something I've thoroughly enjoyed doing in the past, and I'm continuing to do even in this role.
Let's stay with that for a moment, if we can, because one of the things that we have seen over the last few years, and that seems to have accelerated over the last year, is a sort of declining trust in science, certainly among one segment of the population. And that manifests itself in skepticism over climate science, in skepticism over vaccines. in a whole host of sort of other areas where conspiracy theories and fringe beliefs seem to have taken hold. To what do you attribute that? And do you see that as a failure of communications on the part of science?
I think this situation actually calls for way more communication and better communication for sure. I think there's also a concept that I think scientists are very used to that we need to get across the rest of the world, and that's the ability to change your mind based on data. That's what scientists do every single day. You may start with an experiment or a project with a particular assumption or hypothesis in mind. If the data show you, once you've done the experiments, if the data show you that that hypothesis is incorrect, you have to change your mind. And I think that's part of the scientific method. And I think getting that concept out to the broader public is really important. Now, science is never done. And I think, I often hear, and it drives me crazy when I hear people saying the science is out, the science is done. That's not true. Science is always developing and people always changing their minds based on new data. So I think getting comfortable with that concept, being honest about what we know and what we don't know, what we still have to find out, is really important in building trust. So saying things are black and white in science, that's not the case. Things are always grey in the middle, and you're trying to make it clearer and clearer as time goes on.
So let's talk a little bit about the last 12 months and your experiences in the role as CCO. So give me a quick sort of summary of highlights and lowlights, or what you feel was easier than you expected and what was more difficult or more challenging than you expected.
I've kind of been thinking about this as a year of two halves. So I was promoted from within the function. So I know what we do. I know the team very well, and I know the strategies that we have been deploying over the last years. But once you're looking at it from a different viewpoint, so from the very top of the function, I saw things very differently. So things that I thought were really important, when I was looking from the top, I'm like, okay, maybe they're not quite so important. Maybe we need to look at things in a different way. So I think the first part of the year was really all about looking at things through this different lens, through this different perspective, deciding, what we needed to hone in on and what we needed to double down on, and what we perhaps needed to do a bit less of. So that was very interesting. Some assumptions that I had made, last year about coming into this role, actually, when I looked, things looked to be quite different. So the second half of the year has then been, okay, doubling down on the really great things that I believe that we need to be doing more and more of going forward, building the team, focusing on looking at the long-term perspective and where we're going as a company, and therefore as a function for even almost like a 10-year horizon rather than just looking 1 year ahead. So that's been a lot of fun. The second half of the year, I hope, brings us into 2025 with a new perspective and a new sense of belonging and urgency to get our message out.
Tell me a little bit about how the communications function is structured there and how it fits into the sort of management of the company generally, because obviously you're operating in a somewhat unusual environment. You're clearly in a highly regulated industry. You're also in an industry where marketing is restricted in terms of what it can and can't do. What in that kind of environment are the communications priorities and the different stakeholder needs that you've encountered?
So we 100% are not doing marketing. So we have a very clear distinction between what we're doing in communications and what my colleagues are doing in the marketing teams. So the two do not cross. We're completely run very, very separately. The challenges and goals that we have in communications really come across a number of different routes. So first of all, is building awareness that smoke-free alternatives to cigarettes exist, because in many countries people don't even know that they exist. So I think building awareness and helping people understand what they are and how they can contribute to improving public health is one key goal. Second key goal is around regulation, so helping governments and policymakers understand how these products could be regulated in order to speed up the transformation and the transition of people, adults who smoke, away from cigarettes to better alternatives if they don't quit. So helping them to understand so that they can make the right policy-making decisions to help society and improve the public health. And then the last thing we're working on is really more broadly in the corporate reputation bucket. So people have a sort of ingrained dislike often of the tobacco industry and my company in particular. So there we're doing a lot of work to help people understand what a different company we are today than they might have expected. So now we're almost 40% of our net revenues are coming from smoke-free alternatives. We've had product on the market for more than 10 years now, and a lot of people just don't know that. So we've been doing campaigns to help bring that up into the public consciousness, so people can look at us again and perhaps in a slightly different light than they expected. And that's one of my passions, because I've been in the company for such a long time, and I really want people to know how different we are to when I even joined the company almost 20 years ago.
What are your metrics for that? Is it sort of awareness of the changes, or the degree to which people have a favorable impression of the company? I'm assuming at this point, brand love is maybe not something that you would expect to see widespread, but maybe among your customers and users. How are you measuring your success?
Well, I think both of the first two things you mentioned are important. So awareness that we now are a different company, we have transformed, is absolutely critical. And my learning is you've got to tell that message over and over and over and over again. I think there's a theory that you have to tell people something 7 times before they even remember it, never mind change their mind. So there's one large element of that is telling that story again so that we raise awareness. And then the second point is, okay, what's the outcome of that? Once people are aware, how does it influence their opinion of the company and our smoke-free strategy? So that's also something that we're monitoring and measuring to see if we get an uplift once people are aware. Do they support what we're doing as a company? Now, brand love, I'm not so interested in that right now. I think the two key things are awareness and can we influence people's opinion by giving them the facts is really important, those two.
When you and I first connected earlier this year, it was around a really interesting piece of research that you'd done and the publication of a white paper on what you're calling the fifth estate, which I think is a fairly new take on the sort of activist community and those sort of loosely organized stakeholders who have strong opinions about the brands with which they interact, but don't necessarily belong to a traditional media or other sort of estate. Tell me a little bit about the thinking behind that and what you learned as you delved into it.
Well, it was really fascinating. And I think it came from really an intuition that something was going on whereby surprising people were having a voice in our issue, both for the positive and the negative as well. So we have, you mentioned it, I come from a controversial industry, controversial company. and people have strong opinions, we've never really seen much organic support coming from stakeholders over time. But we did see that earlier in the year, based on a politician criticising one of our smoke-free products. And it was really quite intriguing for us to see this groundswell of support behind one of our product brands, and how people were willing to be very vocal about how this product had really benefited them and changed their lives. And I thought, wow, that's really interesting, because what we're used to is the crowd of people telling us that what we're doing is wrong and we shouldn't be doing this, and having very strong moral opinions about us. So I think contrasting those two things, we thought, okay, maybe we're in a different era now. Maybe we're in an era where, people who have strong opinions are willing to voice them, not just the naysayers and the people who, historically have been against our industry. Maybe there's a new set of people who are willing to speak out on this issue and willing to have their voice known. And excuse me, so that's really where the fifth estate idea came from. Let's explore this. Everybody now has a mobile phone. Everybody is connected to social media apps, and they can make the news now. They can make their opinions known really strongly. So that's really where the idea came from. And I think it's resonated quite well as we've gone through the year, because we've seen all sorts of different political campaigns during the year where there has been the voice of the fifth estate has been pretty prominent during it.
So I think I'm right in saying that the first time this phenomenon became apparent to you, it was organic. And somewhat surprising, it sounds like. I assume that some of the value is in the spontaneity and the organic nature of this. So as a company, do you have to be sort of careful about where the line is between an orchestrated response and an organic response, between what in American politics is known as grassroots versus astroturf? And how do you straddle that line of taking advantage of this phenomenon without being seen to be manipulating it?
Well, I think it all comes down to authenticity. I think companies who are trying to engineer a grassroots type of campaign almost always fail. I think people can see through it. And I think that was the beauty of the situation we found ourselves in. It was absolutely nothing to do with us. I mean, absolutely nothing. And that's what made it more powerful, because people were speaking in their own voices with their own views, and doing it in a way that was comfortable for them. And therefore you could see that it was authentic. I think if we try and put our fingerprints on it, it would immediately have gone in the wrong direction. So the big learning for me is authenticity, let things happen. If bad things are happening through the fifth estate, you also need to intervene and set the facts straight, for sure. But I think you can't try and engineer something to appear as if it's organic when it's not. It's just impossible these days. People see right through it.
Yeah. Have you found that this concept of the fifth estate resonates with other companies in other sectors? Is it a phenomenon that they were experiencing but not necessarily putting a name to? And sort of how does it differ from sort of traditional activism, I guess, which is something we've talked about for quite a long time?
Well, I think, yes, it is resonating with other companies. I spoke to many people in Cannes when we met, Paul, and I think other companies are sort of feeling that there's a new movement, there's a new way of bringing news and bringing opinions out to issues, for the good and for the bad. Now, how does it differ from activism? I think it's this organic nature of it. So activism is often or has historically often been spearheaded by particular organizations, non-governmental organizations is one example, who try and rally people around an issue. But the fifth estate that we're seeing now is not governed by these organizations. It's genuine people sitting with their phones and researching things and also making their opinions known. So I think it doesn't have a leader would be the way that I would describe it. Whereas in typical activism, you see one organization or the other who generally takes the lead.
Is this sort of the upside of social media? I guess we've spent so much time as a society and as an industry focusing on some of the negatives with social media over the last year or so, that we've forgotten that it can actually be a conduit for this kind of spontaneous reaction. How do we take advantage of that again without sort of fueling the sort of polarization and the misinformation that's out there?
I think again, it's doing everything with care. I'm always an optimist, and I know social media has had its ups and downs with regard to reputation, but I'm always an optimist, and I think there are tremendously good things that come out of the social media tools that we all have at our disposal today. This sense of community, this sense of rallying around particular subjects, I think is a really valuable thing for society. If you layer on top of that artificial intelligence, I think we have new ways for people to find out the truth and to socialize the truth. So I do think in general, these can be good things. We have to be very careful that they're not misused. And I think that's something that we're very conscious of. When you have a controversy, it can be easy for people to misuse these tools to get their message out there. But I do think there is a tremendous upside to all of the tools.
Since you brought up artificial intelligence, which I feel is sort of one is obligated at this point to discuss it. Anytime we're talking about the future of communications, how are you seeing that change your job at this point, and how do you expect it to change your job going forward?
So I really look at it with two lenses. One is the generative AI part, which is the sort of obvious part for communicators. How can one use those tools really to help you create content and so on, and deploy content in a much faster way? And I think those are all super exciting, and we're learning how to use those every day together with our colleagues here in the office. And I think those are, it's a no-brainer. Those things are really going to help mankind. But I think there's also a more strategic use of AI tools that I'm interested to pursue. And that's really using tools to help you understand better how people think about your issues. And I think there can be real strategic insights that AI can help us to develop in a way that's going to be cheaper, faster, and potentially relatively accurate than the traditional tools we use, like focus groups and so on. So that's something that I'm really excited about. We've got to continue with the generative AI stuff, but what are the more sophisticated things that we can be doing with AI tools that can help us with our strategic thinking in a better way?
So that's more in the sort of cognitive AI arena, where you can use it for red teaming situations and creating persona that you can sort of test messages against, that kind of thing. Because that to me is the intriguing part of where this is going.
Yeah, wouldn't that be exciting if we could do that? And I think it's very difficult to test campaigns before you deploy them, particularly when you're doing something in oftentimes at the speed of light, and it's difficult to get the right audience, the messaging and the campaign in front of the right audience before you really have to deploy. So even if we had AI tools that could give us feedback that's 60 or 70% close to the reality, I think is better than doing nothing. So that kind of tool for me would be a real benefit for all communicators, not just me in my industry.
How has the political change of the last 12 months made your job either more difficult or perhaps even easier in some cases? Obviously, we've seen elections, as everybody was saying at the start of the year, affecting about 2/3 of the world's population, the UK, the US, continental Europe, India, and we're seeing non-elective regime change in places like Syria now. How has all that impacted what you do?
So I try and look at this apolitically because you have to work with what you've got. You don't. We as individuals don't choose who's going to be in governments around the world, but you have to work with the government that is in place, and I think they can all have upsides. They can all have downsides as well. So I think just focusing on what we've got and how we can make sure that our message comes across correctly in whatever political environment we find ourselves in. I think the one thing I am quite happy about is the media can now focus on something else. So we've had, a huge media focus and social media focus on elections in 2024. So I think hopefully in 2025 we'll be able to look at, some other issues as well. And I think that's going to be helpful and interesting too.
Again, since you brought up the media, there's been a lot of commentary, I think, since the election about the declining audience for some traditional mainstream corporate media. We've seen people canceling their Washington Post subscriptions en masse. We've seen a fairly substantial decline in CNN viewership, for example. And at the same time, we've seen some very non-traditional media channels gaining prominence. In America, you can reach more people by talking to podcast hosts than you can talking to some of the traditionally powerful outlets. How does that affect our profession? And do you see that as a decline of media that were trusted and credible? Or do you see it as an opportunity to use non-traditional channels to reach a wider and perhaps more open-minded audience?
I think we all know, we've been skilled in dealing with what's collectively called mainstream media for a long time. We know how it works. And I think that's not going to go away completely. And I think it still will remain a very important part of the work that myself and my team do. But what I'm interested in also is exploring some of these new formats, like you mentioned. Things like podcasts, I think, are super interesting. I'm not just saying that because I'm on one today, but I think it gives people an opportunity to go much deeper into issues. And when they're nuanced, when they're controversial, when they're difficult, sometimes that type of format can be actually much more helpful than trying to do a 3-minute slot on a mainstream TV channel. When you've got to take time to explain things and help readers, listeners, and viewers understand things in a bit more detail, these new formats can be super interesting. What I'm also interested in is some of these smaller outlets where you have a much more focused audience who cares about particular issues and a particular profiles, cares about them very, very deeply. So those are also very interesting, rather than trying to be, all things to all people. Being relevant to the relevant audience that you're trying to reach is just as important. So I see it as it's an interesting time, but I think it's a time where we're all going to learn something new and learn how to use these new tools while not neglecting the old ones.
So we've talked throughout this podcast about the fact that you're working in what has been, certainly in my lifetime, controversial industry. What are the keys to building trust and reputation for a company like yours? And what can other communicators in other increasingly controversial sectors learn from your experience over the last year, do you think?
Well, I think the key for me, and certainly what we've been doing here at Philip Morris International, is something that somebody once termed aggressive transparency. I think we were pretty clear in articulating what the problem was that our product caused. It took some time to get there, but once we did do it in the 1990s, we were clear. And I think that opened up then the opportunity to start to innovate and think about solutions to the problem. And that's when we entered into this phase of transformation. And we recognized pretty early that people were going to be skeptical. So we told people what we were going to do. We're developing these products, we're scientifically assessing them, and we're going to tell you what we found. And we did. We told people, we've been very transparent about the science. We've been transparent about the way that we're commercializing. We're transparent with governments as well as other stakeholder groups. And then you have to keep telling people what you have done, what results you have achieved, and over and over and over again. And I think it's that transparency that can help to build trust. You're never going to completely eliminate the skepticism, but I think if you're consistent, if your words and your actions are aligned consistently, then that helps. And I think people can see that very clearly in the progress we've made, particularly in the last 10 years. We said we were going to do this. We have done it, and we're continuing at pace as well. So I'd encourage anybody in any industry, controversial or not, to really focus on this transparency and authenticity and aligning words with actions. Because the minute they're not aligned, that's when you get in trouble. If you're just only saying things and not actually doing them.
I've always been intrigued by the sort of underpinnings of Net Promoter Score and the idea that what we should be trying to do as communicators is create more advocates and reduce the number of detractors out there. And I wonder, from your perspective, about the balance of those two things. Presumably, there's an audience that is never going to find tobacco or any of its successor products particularly appealing or acceptable. Do you just write those people off as too cynical about the industry to change? Or are you trying to move them at the same time that you're trying to create some brand advocacy at the other end for people who do, in fact, find value in these new products?
Well, I think what you've described perfectly describes the situation we're in. Our audience is on a spectrum for sure. And we do have brand advocates, if you want to call them that, at the one end, who are very supportive of what we're doing.
That was the sort of Fifth Estate thing, right? That
exactly.
these people emerged.
Yeah, and there are many of them who really are supportive of the products, of the scientific approach we've taken, the overall transformation, and the goal we have to ultimately end the sale of cigarettes. So there is a large proportion of people who are at that end of the spectrum. They don't necessarily speak about it because it's not necessarily very fashionable, but they are there and we know they're there. And then at the other end of the spectrum, as you say, we have people who we know will just never change their mind for many reasons, and I'm not going to pass judgment on them. I think I don't spend too much time trying to change those people's minds. What I do spend a lot of time on is that all the people in the middle, the people who are persuadable, the people who maybe haven't thought about this issue, the people who haven't had an opportunity to look at our company in any detail in the last 20 years, those are the people that I really focus on to make sure that they understand the truth behind what we're doing, they understand where we're going. And that's worth time. It's worth a lot of effort to make sure that those people are well informed and not misinformed. So I think that's really how I look at it.
Yeah, and let's just talk briefly about the internal audience and how much time and attention you spend on employees as an audience. Presumably, these are people who knew Philip Morris's history and reputation before they came to work for you, and therefore were open-minded at the very least and supportive at best. How do you sort of keep them engaged and excited about what you're doing and informed about the mission and the transformation, and how do you turn them into brand advocates for you within the marketplace?
This has been one of the joys of my year this year is finding out much more about internal communications, which is something I had never really touched on prior to this role. It is fascinating, I tell you. And we're looking at doing an approach that's broadly termed mixternal. So trying to make sure that employees get the news at the same time as the external world for big announcements. We've had mergers and acquisitions and all sorts of things happening in the last few years. So making sure that employees feel bought into those big news stories and they understand them and they're well informed, as you say, to become advocates. But the thing that's really been a joy this year is we were celebrating our 10-year anniversary of our lead heated tobacco product, so 10 years since it was put on the market. And we did an internal campaign to ask people to share the stories of, how the last 10 years have really changed their lives. It has been the most magical thing. We've had stories from thousands of employees all around the world with their own unique take on our transformation, what it has meant to them personally, the things that they remember, the things that were game changers. And that has been so motivating for all of us. And we've shared some of those externally as well. A real moment of joy and celebration to help keep employees motivated for the next 10 years. So this has been a really nice thing of my job this year, is discovering the real opportunities in internal communications.
And finally, are there any initiatives or issues that you expect to be focusing on more over the next 12 months as you see the changes that are taking place out there in the world?
I think focusing a bit more on the long term is something that I think is really necessary in 2025. We've been through all these elections and tumultuous changes, and it can make you feel very short-termist when you're in that sort of situation. So I'm going to be focusing next year on sitting back and having a much more long-term lens to start to think about how to, shape our narrative and our storytelling for the next 10-year period. And I'm sure a number of companies and comms professionals will be also thinking about doing that. And it comes as a bit of a relief as well, not to be working on just on the day-to-day, but also to have a little bit of envisioning and visionary work to see how we want to show up to the world over the next decade.
Well, that's great. Thank you so much, Moira. It's been a fascinating conversation. You have, I think, a fascinating job. I always think that the more difficult the reputation challenge, the more interesting the work. And I think the work that you've been doing at PMI is an example of that. So thank you very much for your time.
Thank you, Paul. Thank you so much.
You've been listening to the Provoke Podcast, brought to you by Provoke Media and produced by the international broadcast specialist Marketeers.